Implausible Nature now has dice. That's right, you can get these awesome D6s made by our partner, Baron of Dice. These custom dice have the Implausible Nature logo on the 6 side and also come with square corners, which means they will roll more evenly than rounded corner dice. Head on over to baronofdice.com and use discount code IN40K to get a discount on your order and support us at the same time. Check out his full collection of dice for all your gaming needs with the link down in the description.
Welcome to Implausible Nature, your home for all things Black Templar. On today's video, we are talking deployment, specifically when to deploy and when not to deploy, aka stick it in strategic reserves, or if it has deep strike, do that. There is a lot of nuance and a lot of strategy that goes into the deployment phase, a lot more than you might think. And it's something that casual players or less experienced players often fall prey to of more experienced players is knowing when to reserve something and when not to. And it can be often a pretty critical decision where it could even potentially cost you the game or win you the game, conversely. On today's video, we're going to kind of dive into uh, the ins and outs of when you should put something in reserve and what should you put in reserve. What are the types of units that you should be putting in reserve when you are playing your games of 40K? Bob, to get us kicked off here, um, you know, as far as reserves go, what is the kind of the rule of thumb? Obviously, we only have 500 points of strategic reserves that we can use. So for things that don't have deep strike, what are kind of the rule of thumb of what do we want to put in reserves, and when are we going to decide to do that? So
All right. So the very first rule that I kind of have when I'm doing or making the decision, it's kind of a twofold. And remember that this is a very vague rule of thumb. So this is not going to be wholesale for every situation, every game. But what you're going to be doing is if you are questioning on your turn, if you do not get the first turn and you have to hide everything, is your if you're worried about your opponent shooting you and taking out important things in your list, that's your first red flag that I need to reserve something.
do you have
The
too much
second
stuff
piece,
to fit in the deployment zone?
yes. So you can't hide it sufficiently enough. You're going to lose something important. And you're like, ah, dang, now I'm not able to run my game plan properly. Or you lose some sort of strategy that you have going into your game plan. But the other thing, and possibly even more important thing, if you have something that's going to be going into strategic reserve, you're going to lose a turn with it, obviously. So a lot of times the first turn is setup. Second turn maybe even be set up as well. Just the start of the killing going in turn 3, turn 4, that type of thing. But with that being said, if you're going to bring it on turn 2 or turn 3 at the latest, you want it to do something the turn that it comes in. So a lot of times what you're going to be reserving is going to be something that has a longer range gun, or even those mid-range things coming in on a board or a deployment edge for your opponent and being able to shoot something important. A good example for this is going to be something like eradicators. They have short range, but they can do something once they come off that board, right? They have 18-inch range with the melter rifles, but they can hit those monsters or vehicles with that range. You're probably not going to get into melter range, but in some detachments that will be less of an issue than others if you're running Firestorm. But they're kind of fragile, right? You only have 3-man units, or at most you can have the 6-man unit, but you can MSU them for the 95 points. I believe they are 85 points, something like that. Um,
Something like that.
get
Yeah.
three of them. Get three of them off the board. Put them in strategic reserve. Plop them back on the board, and starting turn 2, and take something off the board. You don't have to worry about their durability. They do are pretty wide based, so they're harder to hide and they take up room. This is a good way
They're
to,
slow also.
yep, be able to save some of that room in your deployment zone by putting something into reserve. So again, rule of thumb: if you are worried about hiding something and losing it, that's the red flag. And then the second piece is going to be, if I put it in reserve, is it going to do something when it comes on? You don't want to waste more than 2 turns.
Yeah. And something that to note, remember that you have to declare your reserves prior to deploying any units.
Yep.
So I really encourage you to you're going to have to get good at sort of measuring in your mind almost how much you can fit behind pieces of terrain and what your sight lines are going to look at. And if you have terrain at home, this is something that you can practice at home. Or if you have tabletop simulator, this is something that you can practice with that as well. Of course, that's sort of a different animal than playing it. If you're trying to use that to practice to measure something in real life, you're going to have trouble.
Yeah.
It can at least give you an idea on sight lines. Obviously, especially at a tournament, you don't have a lot of time. During deployment, you don't want somebody to chess clock you because you're like taking forever to try to figure out, before you even deploy anything. So this is something that you'll need to practice sort of on your own time. But getting the feel for how much space your army takes up and where it can be hidden. So yeah. So that's a great rule of thumb to go by. What are some other times when we might want to reserve something?
All right. So there's three different types of lists really that are out there. There's aggressive, there's hybrid, which is kind of a shooty and melee. A good example would be like Space Marines. And then there's the shooty list. So a lot of times when you are going to reserve, you're going to be facing those heavy gun line type lists, whether it be Imperial Guard or Tau or maybe Leagues of Wotan, uh, different armies like that that are going to reach across the board and put the hurt on you if you're not hidden. So those are times where you can do that. Another time, and expanding on that a little bit more, is if you have the advantageous uh, or it gives you an advantage to put some guns off the side of the board. So maybe you have a couple lancers, and okay, I know with the current terrain and maybe my opponent's running more elite, I can't see anything. Okay, so I'm going to get them off the board, put them into reserve. Second turn, it's, they'll come onto the board, even though it's 6 inches. I'll get some shots. That's going to be at different angles, different sight lines from, deployment to deployment zone. So then maybe I got some shots that it's going to be more quality. Maybe you potentially take away their cover on whatever vehicle that it wants to shoot, and you can do some damage rather than spending 2 turns to try and maneuver to get that sight line that you honestly may not even get a good one if they don't take you down in the first place. So, and then there's also the deep strike thing. So you have to be thinking about your secondaries as well. Obviously, if you're playing tactical, you're not going to know what it is before the hand because you have to declare the reserves before the game. But a good example would be like Inceptors. Those are always going to go on deep strike because you want to be able to play the strategic. Oh, I'm going to deep strike in and get this quarter, or I'm going to jump on this objective so I can get my secondary, or what type of thing. So those are going to be like the things that you do for strategic purposes. There's times when units such as Terminators, assault Terminators, benefit from being in reserve. You can play the mental game with things like teleporters. Um, we've had a guest on on a video before who talked about the different shenanigans that you can play, the mind games with your opponent with the teleporter and um, coming in on your opponent's turn to get that that scare factor.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's more beneficial just to walk them. So you just have to kind of see what type of army your opponent's playing. If they're more aggressive, putting them on the board is better. If they're just going to sit back and shoot you,
Something like World
deeps.
Eaters,
Yep.
where they have
Uh,
almost next to no shooting at all, or
yep.
Chaos Demons. Some armies like that, you can literally almost just deploy stuff out in the open
Yep.
because they're not going to get to it at the first turn. So as long as you screen properly, that kind of thing. But yeah, against armies like Tau, Dark Eldar, the more shooting centric armies, even like the mid range armies, um, Space Marines, Votan. You gotta make sure that you're protecting your valuable units so that your lancers and your vindicators and your ballistas don't get shot off the board before they even do anything,
Yep.
because that's a worst case scenario. Um, so yeah, so the uh, as far as like what type of army, I think that's a great shout. You gotta sort of assess your opponent's army, and assess it pretty quickly, especially in like a tournament setting, and even in a casual game. Like we said, you don't want to take too much time. So understanding and knowing which of the armies that you have to do different styles of deployment against and what to do how to deploy against that army is definitely could be critical. If you don't screen well against a really aggressive melee army, they're going to run over you. Likewise, if you don't hide enough, against somebody like Tau, they're going to blow you off the board. So, or do enough damage to really impact uh, your shooting or your ability to deal damage for the rest of the game.
Yep.
Um, so yeah. So now, what about utilizing a something like rapid ingress? If we are putting stuff in reserves, how often are you going to rapid ingress something, Bob? Is that something that we're just going to take advantage of regardless and pick an important unit to bring in, potentially on their turn? Or, are we going to really dependent on what that unit is?
Yeah, it's really going to be unit dependent based on your list. So obviously, I talked about the Terminator squad. So that's something like that. You have to know that you're going to be able to survive the shooting of your opponent, especially when you're presumably going to be aggressive with that particular unit if they're coming in from deep strike, uh, because your opponent's going to be scared. Obviously, you just messed up their plans, you're going to get shot. So you have
Yeah.
to take the shots. But there is some play around it. So we talked about the Inceptors. We all know that they can deep strike within 3 inches of an opponent. If your opponent didn't screen very well, you can use rapid ingress to get those onto the board and potentially take an objective or a secondary before it rolls into your turn to get those points. So that's important to think about as well if you're using those Inceptors. Um, but in general, you want to make sure that your unit that you're rapid ingressing is going to be durable enough to take some shots, or just has enough bulk to be able to do what it needs to do come your turn. So vehicles coming in, a lot of times they're probably not going to kill you on that turn if you, uh,
Depending on what it is. Yeah.
you know,
If a hammerhead is
that's
shooting
for sure.
you're probably going to die. But
But you can, depending on the side of the board that you come in, you can mitigate some of that through cover,
mhm.
maybe not in range of all their guns, that type of thing. So you really can kind of play that. So you have to be strategic on where you're dropping in. I do not suggest just dropping right in front of your opponent's entire army. So that's never a good plan. But you can use it to jump on objectives, or if you have MSU, you can be sacrificial with some of those different things. Maybe you have jump intercessors. You can
Yeah.
sacrifice them potentially, as long as they live down to that one man and they pass that battle shock. That could be something they can take that quarter or that secondary, or whatever you need to do for them. So, rapid ingress is going to be your friend. It's one of your toolkit pieces in uh, your toolbox to be able to take some secondaries. Honestly, so it's or be very aggressive depending on the unit. So that's something that I would always be putting off to the side and just remember and use it. Mind game, and we're like, oh, don't forget, I have rapid ingress. Don't forget,
Yep.
I have rapid ingress. So good players are not going to forget that. But you know, if you're if all you're planning to play is locally and uh, rogue rogue tournaments, I mean, those players may not be
As
top
savvy.
tier.
Yeah.
So I just want to you get behind their skull a little bit and make them think, so they might
Yep.
make mistakes.
Live rent free in their head for a little while.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right. You got to really just kind of assess when and where you want that unit to come in. Something like a lancer, probably not going to rapid ingress that because number one, it has massive range. Number two, it as long as you pick a good fire lane to put it in, it's not. It's not something that's ultra durable. I would consider maybe a vindicator, depending on what they have and where I'm putting it. If I could keep it out of the way of their biggest guns, so that way it could then move and then shoot on my turn, something like that. Or especially with eradicators, they're nice and smallish. As far as a footprint, 3-man eradicator squad. Even a 6-man is not super big, pretty easy to hide or get them in cover. When you bring them in on that rapid ingress, so that way they can move and shoot on the following turn. Um, so um,
I would
so
even say
yeah,
something like a land raider could be rapid ingress, so that's going to
mm,
survive and then you can move on your next turn and
yeah,
drop the cargo.
yep,
Repulsors would be good for that as well. Come in 6 inches on their turn. Then the next turn it can move, jump out. You're aggressively deployed on their side of the board. Then you can jump out and get the movement and the charge, that type of thing. So those big bulky vehicles have the opportunity to do that
yeah.
successfully
And
with rapid
something to
ingress.
note with the eradicators, even if you don't think to you like you're it's not like a movement thing. Like, well, I'm going to put them here so that way I can move them on my turn. Even if you can find a good spot where they can shoot next turn, then they don't have to move, and they don't count as moving because they didn't arrive this turn. So now you're going to get heavy, which with their limited number of shots, hitting on twos and threes is going to be much nicer than threes and fours. So a good, especially with rerolls. So good bump in damage for them on that. So speaking of units, what are kind of our ideal units, Bob, to just put in reserves in general?
I kind of touched on it a little bit already, but I typically try and do things that are going to do something when they come in. So if you're not planning on doing a rapid ingress issue, like with a big dangerous unit that's in a land raider or something to that effect, also remember you have to be under the 500 points. So just make sure that that unit
Hmm.
is appropriately pointed.
Right.
But guns are the big one. So a lot of times that first turn, if even if you have that first turn, you're not going to get line of sight on whatever your opponent has. So that's where you get the reserves that come in turn two, and then they can get that shot off, because you can't guarantee that your opponent's going to give you some shots from their movement in turn two.
Yeah.
And then when your turn 2 comes around, um, they you still want to get quality shots. So this is a good way to make sure that you can help in that uh, facet. Plus, you're also forcing a response from your opponent, which does allow you to either get more aggressive, play the board a little bit more, um, come in and get those secondaries, whatever you need to do with that particular game and mission. But if you're playing something on the sides of the board, or even if it's on turn 3 in their deployment zone, they're forced to react to what you're doing. And that's very important in any game. You have to be unpredictable. You have to force them to react to you, whether it be them trying to screen you out, moving to adjust for where you might not be able to do, moving away from the likely places that you're going to come in on the board. That's all very important to your game plan. That is going to cut down on the options that your opponent has on the board. So guns are a big one. Sometimes, I mentioned already, those big melee threats are important to bring on, whether it be strategic reserve or deep strike unit. Sometimes you might want to deep strike those jump intercessors. So, in a corner someplace behind terrain where you are not going to get shot, most likely. And then they can just move into position the next turn. So maybe they could just claim a corner
12-inch
on one
move.
secondary and then just move on to the next one
Yeah.
as you need to. So they're small footprints, so they're very easy to use. And one thing that we haven't really talked about is scouts. Scouts are
Hmm.
something that we are going to be taking in a lot of lists. They're going to deploy them on the board, but we're going to uppy downy them, as
Yep.
it's a lot of times talked about. So they're going to be yanked off the board and put somewhere on one of the sides of the board and be useful again. So
And if
always
you're
make
not
use of
familiar
that.
with scouts, they have an ability. It's called guerrilla tactics, and what it allows them to do at the end of your opponent's movement phase. I think they have to be a certain distance away from any enemy units, but you can pick them up and put them in strategic reserves. Pretty powerful ability to, pick them up off the board. You deploy them on turn 1 to screen or to potentially do a secondary or something. And then they also have the scouts rule. So if you deploy them in a place and then you're like, you want to be thinking about, well, am I gonna move these guys back if I don't get first turn, or where am I gonna scout them to if I don't get first turn? So you'll be able to pluck them off the board multiple times a game and bring them back in the following turn for some additional reserves shenanigans. But I think that's a really great point you were making about making your opponent react, because even against skilled veteran players, if they know, okay, the Lancer is over there and it can't shoot me as long as I stay over here, but I can still see some of your things. Now they can work out what your threat is, right? But if your Lancer could be over here or over here or over there, in a number of different places, you're either forced to try to like spread the board more to try to negate where I can come in, which means that now your different units are going to have less support for each other because they're going to be farther apart, or you're going to be forced to concede to, giving up these fire lanes,
Yep.
and like you said, reacting to what we're doing, what you're doing, versus what your opponent is doing. So that's a really important point, I think, that you know even if the unit that you have in reserves comes in, only gets a couple turns of shooting, if it affects how your opponent plays the game, then that's part of its job as well. It's not all about what it kills. So a lot of it is
Yep.
about, if you can score points with it, if you can force your opponent to do things they don't want to do or react in ways that they weren't planning to. That's also a big chunk of the battle. Um, so yeah, so You mentioned melee units. That's not something that we typically think of reserving. What kind of melee units might you reserve? Would you consider reserving like a 20-man with Grimaldus, or are you going to walk them always, or are we just talking about like Terminators, or what types of melee units are you thinking of reserving, Bob? If you
So
were
20 man
going
with
to,
Grimaldus, typically would prefer to put on the board. There is some skew potential to have him come in on reserve, but the thing is, when you come in strategic reserve, you do have to come in on your board edge up to 6 inches. You can't assault with them. You can't
yeah.
advance, so you're stuck with that. So 6 inches is
Well, you can
really not.
charge, but a 9+ inch charge is going to be hard to make.
Yeah, but it is kind of a tight space, that 6 inches to fit a
Mhm.
20 man unit. So
Yeah.
that's probably not the most ideal. But when I'm talking about like a melee unit coming in, it's like I mentioned, you're going to have, uh, ideally, you're going to do rapid ingress on something that's maybe it's a sword brother squad and an impulsor, right? You can't really hide it very well. Or maybe you keep one on the board and you the other one in strategic reserves because you probably have the sword brethren plus the impulsor plus a,
Character. Yeah.
a character with it. So you're not able to fit two of them in 500 points, right? So you keep one on the board, and maybe you keep your Hellberg one off the board. So you rapid ingress it. They're in the impulsor, so they are reasonably protected on your
Yep.
opponent's turn. Oh, if they blow it up, okay, maybe you lose one on
Explosion. Yeah.
emergency disembark. Okay, so you still have a 5 man squad left that you can use to now assault because you are halfway across the board now instead of having to move and then worry about, do I have to disembark so I can set up the charge, or do I just sit there in the open and then disembark on the next turn? You take away that, you're rapid ingressed. Now you're there. You can jump out on your turn because you're much closer, and then you can assault something that's squishy. So
Yep.
that would be a good example of utilizing your rapid ingress. You could use also. I talked about the land raiders. Put the land raider with a unit inside there. They're especially good because then you can have the potential for Overwatch if your opponent's close enough, and it's maybe you
If you
have the
can squeeze it
Redeemer.
in there.
Yeah,
those
yeah,
those points changes are rough.
yeah. So there's that, and then the next turn you can move it and then drop out and then assault on it. So there's a few things that I would say that you might be able to put in. 10 man would be something that could be decent. 10 man Primaris Crusader squad. I've only done it a couple times, but I didn't rapid ingress them. But they are still decent to put into strategic reserve sometimes, because then you can put uh, a big, fairly large, bulky Space Marine body unit in potentially your opponent's side of the board in one of
Yep.
his quarters, that your opponent now has to deal with, concentrate some fire to fully take them out, unless they're loaded with damage too. I would not do that against Eldar because they're going to die. But depending on your opponent, that might be a good option, especially if they're very aggressive, because you do want to have screening units if you're facing aggressive list like the World Eaters, so that you can intercept the charge and you can have your counter charge, which hopefully will be more devastating than their initial charge. But if you have something that's in strategic reserve, because most of the time they're just going to go straight at you with everything they got, and they're not going to leave a ton in their backyard, right? So if you
Yep.
have that strategic reserve Primaris Crusader squad or whatever it is on the backside, now they have to either A, leave something behind, which makes their charge less devastating, or B, they got to screen you out, which is the same type of thing, or it's undefended and you score points.
Yep.
So that's one way to help blunt the blow of an aggressive list. Orcs, the same type of thing. They screen with all their bodies and all their dangerous uh, assault units that they want to come screaming at you. They don't like exposing their backside. So that's something to think about there.
Yeah, and then a Crusader squad is cheap enough that if you put it down and they, you know, spend resources to kill it, you haven't lost that many points, and it's probably going to cost them a lot more resources to essentially turn around and come back to it to kill it. So I mean, it's only 140 points for that squad. For 140 points, they're pretty durable. And they they're they're quite efficient, and unchecked, they can deal some pretty good significant damage. So,
And they're
you
also
know,
battle line, so you can score some additional points with them as well on
yeah,
some
in
secondaries.
some missions or whatnot, and there's also that one mission that allows battle line to come in turn one if you wanted to or something. So, um, definitely some options for them. So, I think that's definitely some great advice. Um, Anything else you want to add, Bob?
Yeah, I just want to talk a couple of moments on deployment in general. So, this is a skill that will take you practice. No one can tell you how to do it. So, I very highly recommend you take a look at the current Games Workshop tournament packs that are posted on the website and look at what their recommended battle uh, fields look like. Then you need to simulate that, whether you're using cardboard boxes or pop cans or whatever you need to do. Put it on a board and then plop your army behind it.
Yeah,
So that way you can see, okay, this is my army, it's visible.
yeah,
This is the problem that I'm going to have if I'm facing any army, because you never want to expose your army if you can help it to your opponent. So you always want to be hiding, even just as standard, whether or not they're shooting or not, unless it's a very like they don't have any guns. Then
yeah.
obviously you're deploy
Which is
back,
like
or if
two
they're
armies in the game.
yeah, yeah.
And
So
it's you don't even have to have terrain. Like honestly, like save some cereal boxes or get some cardboard from
yep,
from the boxes that the minis came in. The sizes for the pieces of terrain are standard. Just cut out the template, and then you can arrange that on the board. Like, yeah, you won't be able to simulate the true line of sight stuff that will be blocked by a true line of sight, but you will at least be able to get an idea on what can I hide behind what is effectively, what we used to call obscuring, like behind ruins that just can't be seen through period. So, it's pretty easy. The information is right there on their website, as how big these things are. So,
yep.
just use cardboard. If you don't have terrain, just use cardboard. It's that simple.
And I think adding on to that, I think it's very important that you remember, and a lot of newer players do not, that you do not have to be facing your opponent with your units, especially important with vehicles where you can deploy them sideways or
Yeah.
kittywampus, however you want to do it, to make sure that they are not
Hmm.
visible. If you have to play it backwards, it doesn't matter. Now, there is the rules that you have to pivot and you'll lose the 2 inches if you're not on a round base. So you do have to play into that, but you most likely will be pivoting anyway to get back from behind the terrain piece anyway. Um, and in my opinion, the 2 inches is a lot better than it used to be anyway. So just kind of remember that. And my last piece of advice is infiltrators. If you have first turn, utilize them aggressively, and not necessarily infiltrators defensively. I mean, like the special rule
Yeah.
infiltrators. So if you have first turn, you can be aggressive with them, get them close to an objective so that you can move on to them, as long as they're still hiding and you are not going to give up a shot, so that you can get that turn. on the first turn, move on to an objective in case you don't win that roll.
Right.
So then, that if they're at the bottom of the second turn or bottom of the first turn, and your opponent's shooting at you, they don't die, and then you can start scoring the top of 2 on some of those things. But if you're at the bottom of the first turn, I would not be aggressive with those units, because you're going to have to suffer through 2 turns
Yeah.
of shooting rather than just the one. So just some slight tidbits there.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, thank you, Bob, for all that advice. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully, it was informative for you. We do want to do more of these tactics style videos. Advice on gameplay itself, that kind of thing, because I think that's where a lot of people are really enjoying that kind of content and want to improve their game, not just through list building and some of the other things, but through real world gameplay tactics. So let us know down in the comments what you guys think. Anything that we forgot, anything that you disagree with, we want to know. So let us know down in the comments. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button, all the YouTube button things. And don't forget to check out our Patreon. We have an awesome set of bonuses. We truly appreciate all of our patrons. We could not do this without you guys. So thank you so much for that support. And check out our Discord. Got a lot of great things going on every day in our Discord, very active community. So come check that out. And until next time, keep on crusading.